Alright, I was going to wait till Monday to make this video so that we could see the weekend Steam numbers for Marathon, but instead, I'm just going to talk about it 24 hours after its release because the truth is, what I am going to say in this video stands true regardless of how things play out for the game over the weekend. Maybe they get 50% more players. Being generous, that would put them around 130,000 concurrent players, but truth be told, I don't see it hitting that. I could also delay this video until their endgame map comes out to see how that's received. It's supposed to be their raid-like event similar to the Vault of Glass in Destiny 1, which arguably changed the fortunes for D1 and was revolutionary for its time. But I honestly don't see it making a big enough splash to entice players to play this game. I could very well be wrong though, but I doubt it. A lot of people online complain about Steam charts and say they don't matter and this and that, but the truth is they do matter. When D2 was dropping on Steam, people coped and said it didn't matter because the majority of players are on console. But then Popularity Report came out and it showed the exact same trends. It's absolutely foolish to think that games live in a bubble as if only PC players are stepping away but the game is still perfectly healthy on console. What it is cope, and I have never seen so much cope for a game than I have for Marathon. People trying to justify roughly 90,000 peak players as healthy for the game, or saying it's a niche genre because it's a hardcore extraction shooter. Well, that sentiment can easily be debunked with a case study from October in Arc Raiders. The current game reportedly has its issues, sure, every ongoing live service game does. I've seen it with Apex Legends and Helldivers 2 and Marvel Rivals and so on. All live service games go through ebbs and flows from it's so over to we're so back. It's natural. But let's look at Arc Raiders for a minute. The game released to a day one peak of around 250,000 players, and then it popped off like crazy, actually going up over time to hit an all-time peak of 482,000. It nearly doubled from its launch day to its peak concurrent player count. Now, this could absolutely happen with Marathon. It could go from 90k to 180k, and I'm sure Bungie will be thrilled. But the truth is, this is the exception, not the norm. Halo Infinite had 273,000 players on the day it launched, and then it was a precipitous decline from there. It lost 50% of its player base month over month, 150k in December, 60k in January, 30k after that, 15k after that. And by then, it was basically dead. And reports are that the game actually got a lot better after some updates as well, but that wasn't enough to bring people back. Truth is, usually you have one shot at a first impression, and if that doesn't go well, people just tend to not come back. For Arc Raiders, the reception was super strong, so it actually grew over time, which is awesome to see. Good games should get rewarded. People want to just play good games. But when you try and argue that Arc Raiders smoked Marathon on launch, people cope by saying it isn't a real extraction shooter. Like, okay, maybe it is more casual, sure, but I am sure Bungie was looking to hook in those sweet casuals, because that brings us to our next point of context, Bungie's former game, Destiny 2. In February of 2023, they had an all-time peak player count of 316,000 players with the launch of their Lightfall expansion. The campaign was not received well, however, so the player base dropped off, as it always does, mind you, as you can see from the chart. The yearly expansion releases were always their peak. Point is, 316,000 players is a lot more than 88,000. Ironically, that is the exact same low the game saw in July of 2023 during Season of the Deep, which I also played less than I usually do because I just wasn't into it that season. Point is, 88,000 was the lowest month they had to that point in 2023, and it rebounded back over 100k with their next season. Then in October of 23, the studio was hit with layoffs as they had missed revenue projections by 45%. That is a substantial miss, and it tells you how out of touch Bungie's executives are. But that is exactly the point here. Their expectations are not in line with reality. These suits haven't accepted that the COVID surge was a once-in-a-lifetime boon to the gaming industry because everyone was stuck inside gaming. That was obviously never going to last, but in the modern world of capitalism, line must always go up. You must reach new revenue records every year or else layoffs. So if hitting your all-time peak of 300,000 players and dipping to a low of 88,000 wasn't enough to avoid layoffs, then why do people think that Marathon getting 88,000 on launch is a win? Sure, it is good for a game in general, but context is so important. It is not enough for Bungie and Sony. Then we jump to 2024 Destiny 2 and the launch of the final shape. It's a true high point for the game, delivering on the closure of a 10-year storyline, or 5 depending on if you count Shadowkeep as the start of the Light and Darkness saga. Regardless, it was a capstone moment and a satisfying conclusion to a long-running story arc. They nearly matched the 316,000 player peak of Lightfall, and things were great. Then, as always happens, the player base dropped off, this time settling in around 40 to 80,000 players, but the expansion was loved by players and critics alike compared to Lightfall, which was not received well. But still, the same fate met the studio with layoffs in late July to the tune of 17% of the studio. So within 10 months, they had 2 rounds of layoffs, laying off over 25% of their company. And this was with a somewhat successful live service performing decently well. Again, player counts that were around what Marathon's day one peak is. Sure, they had incubation projects at the time that would go on to be cancelled, and now their overhead is less because, as mentioned, they laid off a bunch of employees. And they also did this at the end of the month so that they could avoid paying certain benefits. So sure, their overhead is less now, so they don't need quite the numbers that Destiny 2 needed to stay afloat, a game that needed constant updates and reportedly had a very high burn rate. But even with that taken into account, the numbers can't be looking all that great to the Sony and Bungie brass. Oh, and for what it's worth, Destiny expansions were like more than full price games. If you bought the yearly pass, that was the season and all expansions and dungeon keys, so it was around $100. Marathon is $40, so it's selling less copies at a lower price. Again, context. Megabonk hitting 117,000 peak concurrence is undoubtedly huge. It was made by a solo developer. I don't know what Marathon cost to make, but it was definitely in the hundreds of millions, and it was delayed at least twice, so probably taken around 6 years of dev time. We don't know the specifics, but again, what is a raving success for one game is a disappointment for another if it's from an expensive AAA studio. People try and defend it by saying Marathon is a niche game for a niche audience, and that's all well and good for small budget games, but this game did not have a small budget, I guarantee you that. And Bungie isn't trying to reach just a small audience, they want to be the Fortnite of the extraction shooter scene. Again, context matters. Some studios would kill to reach 88,000 concurrents, but I know Bungie and I assure you that this is not what they are looking for. In fact, Bungie had another Destiny 2 expansion release last summer in the Edge of Fate, and it only barely peaked over 100,000 players. And the D2 community talked about how concerning that was and how it might finally be the end. This was 2/3 less than their previous 2 expansions. So again, in context, that looks really bad. Sure, 100,000 is a high number, but it's a lot less than 300,000. However, now, in the same breath, people are pretending that Bungie's new IP release is somehow a success at 88,000 players on day one. I'm not buying it. That is 20,000 less than Edge of Fate, which was an overwhelming disappointment. They have also encouraged gaming outlets to hold off on their reviews until later in the month when the whole game releases. Here's a thought: release your whole game with a ton of content and just let players enjoy the fucking game. But no, Bungie is way too obsessed with their weekly active user metrics. They do tons of backhanded tactics to bolster them in any way possible. The saving grace for the game is the early reviews are good. As I showed, this helped our creators grow post-launch, so it's definitely possible the game could still grow. But another Sony live service we can compare to is Helldivers 2, a much beloved game that took the gaming world by storm when it released in February 2024. It peaked at 458,000 players on Steam, an absolutely massive launch. And now it hovers around 50,000 players daily, which is very respectable for any live service game. But the point is, that is almost a 90% drop off from its peak. So a big drop off, but it had such a large population to begin with that it could easily survive that drop off. Battlefield 6 is in a very similar boat, around 50,000 daily players, but a far cry from the near 750,000 launch peak. The point is, they had room for a lot more people to leave. If Marathon loses half of its peak, that will put it in the 40,000s. Again, not bad at all, but if it loses 90%, like the ones I just mentioned, it will be down around 10,000, and I don't know if that is enough to sustain a game like this. And then you have the people talking about, oh, people went to bed, that's why Marathon dropped off. There are other markets that can play games. Slay the Spire 2 is an indie game in early access, and it just continued to climb the entire day of its launch, finally hitting a peak of 430,000 players at like 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. So again, context matters. Not every game drops off at night in North America. It just shows that there isn't broad appeal for Marathon outside of the North American audience. So that is more what I wanted to talk about in this video. People use Steam charts to write all kinds of narratives to support their arguments, and I just did that in this video. But I backed it up with context, and it would do people well to keep context in mind when it comes to these things. Resident Evil 9 Requiem released this week and hit 344,000 players on Steam. That is a single player campaign. So when it inevitably drops off in the next 2 months, that is not a big deal. The game is made and complete and has been released and it sold well. People can go back and play it whenever they like. Live service games need a thriving population for months and years to survive. Point is, a drop-off for one type of game is no big deal at all, where a drop-off for another can be catastrophic, as we are seeing right now with Destiny 2. We also had people dissecting sales figures, and same thing. Of course Marathon will rate highly in sales figures because it is one of like 3 games releasing this week. That's not a great metric to use because there's just not a ton of games releasing every single week. People buy games when they are new, we know this. So all of this is to say that after a day, it is not looking super bright for Marathon. Maybe every player playing it loves it and will main the game for a year and beyond, who knows. And maybe word of mouth will spread and it will actually grow an audience. But that is the exception to the rule. Most high-profile AAA games tend to come out the gate hot and slowly bleed players. Indie games are the ones that spread through word of mouth and grow over time by and large. So again, we will see how all this plays out, but I wanted to give my audience context behind the numbers that they are seeing. Anyways, that's it from me. Join the Discord and follow me on Twitch. Links are in the description. Like and sub if you enjoyed, and leave a comment telling me what you think about Marathon and its future. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.